So I want you to picture the most powerful symbol of human connection you can think of.
Right.
You're probably visualizing, I don't know, a massive steam locomotive just tearing across a grassy plain in the 1850s.
Yeah, steel tracks cutting right through the wilderness.
Exactly. Or maybe you picture the first transatlantic telegraph cable getting dropped into the ocean, finally linking continents together.
Sure.
Because we all carry this incredibly comforting, deeply ingrained assumption that heavy industrial hardware is what, pulled humanity out of the dark ages of isolation.
It's the textbook story.
Right. The story tells us that before the steam engine, you basically live in a disconnected, frozen little village, entirely cut off from the global market.
And then the machine arrived to save us all.
Exactly. But today, we're doing a deep dive into something that totally shatters that assumption.
It really is the ultimate technological myth.
Yeah.
I mean, we naturally credit the hardware for shrinking the world because, well, the hardware is loud, it's physical, and it leaves a very obvious mark on the landscape.
But I want you to imagine a completely different scene for a second. It's 1740. You are in Sweden.
Okay.
You are standing in knee-deep, freezing mud. There is no steam engine anywhere.
Right.
There is no telegraph. The fastest way to send a message is literally to hand it to a guy on a horse and just, hope the horse doesn't break a leg in the snow.
Good luck with that.
Right. According to everything we are taught, the markets in a country like that should be completely fractured. I mean, the price of wheat in the South should have absolutely nothing to do with the price of wheat in the North.
Exactly. And that is the exact assumption we are dismantling today.
I'm so ready for this.
So we are looking at a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper by Mario J. Crucini and Gregor W. Smith.
Okay.
And they examined a staggeringly massive data set of Swedish commodity prices.
Yeah.
I mean, this stretches from 1732 all the way to 1914.
Wow.
And what the data reveals is going to, honestly, completely upend how you think about progress.
Because the biggest shift happened way earlier, right?
Yes. The most aggressive, miraculous era of market integration, like the actual moment when the world truly started to pull together, happened decades before the first railway track was ever laid down.
That is just wild to me. Freezing merchants, horse-drawn wagons, and wooden ships somehow achieved a level of economic synchronization that, quite frankly, should have been physically impossible.
It really seems impossible on paper.
I am genuinely struggling to wrap my head around the mechanics of this. I mean, how could prices across a geographically massive, brutally cold country synchronize without a single piece of modern technology to tie them together?
Well, to understand that impossible synchronization, we first have to look at how we even know this happened in the first place.
Right, because we don't have, digital receipts from the 1700s.
Exactly. Proving an economic shift from 3 centuries ago requires a level of statistical evidence that leaves no room for doubt.
Right.
The researchers didn't just rely on diaries or sweeping historical narratives. They built this entire analysis on the life's work of the historian Leonard Jorberg. He published this incredibly exhaustive history of prices in Sweden back in 1972.
And when you say exhaustive, I mean, the scale here is almost hard to process.
Oh, it's massive.
Jorberg and his team tracked 32 different towns across Sweden.
32.
And they tracked 19 different commodities. And they did this every single year for 182 years.
Yeah, just think about the labor involved in that.
It's insane. They tracked everything from agricultural staples like wheat and butter to livestock like oxen and sheep, all the way to industrial raw materials like bar iron, log timber, and even lighting goods like wax candles.
And the origin of this data is a story in itself, really.
Right, because historians don't just find magical spreadsheets buried in a field.
No, they don't. Jorberg's team had to manually excavate these numbers from what were known as market price scales.
Okay, what are those?
They were highly official, incredibly tedious government records.
Oh, bureaucracy. Got it.
Always bureaucracy. The Swedish crown needed to calculate tithes to the church, levy taxes, and, settle official government debts.
Right.
And to do that accurately, they needed to know exactly what the physical goods in their kingdom were actually worth at any given time.
So the local bureaucrats were essentially forced to act as early data scientists.
That's a great way to put it.
Because every single winter, they would record the average current prices of these 19 goods in their local market towns.
Yeah.
And the paper actually mentions they did this on a very specific day, right? Thomas Mess.
Yes, Thomas Mess, which is December 21st.
Okay.
They did that up until 1803. And then they moved the recording to November. But the consistency of that government mandate is what makes this such a statistical goldmine.
Because you have the exact same date.
Right. You have an entire nation, highly motivated by tax collection, writing down the exact cost of a candle or a pound of beef on the exact same day every single year in 32 different locations.
That is just, I mean, the discipline.
And when Yerberg compiled all of those physical ledgers, it resulted in over 500,000 relative price observations.
Oh, God.
502,689 to be incredibly precise.
500,000 data points from the 18th and 19th centuries. That is wild.
Yeah.
And when you have 32 towns, the mathematical combinations allow you to pair them up in, 436 different ways?
Exactly. 496 town pairs.
So you can compare town A to town B, town A to town C, and so on. You can cross-reference the price of a candle in literally every possible direction across the map.
Which is crucial, because with a sample size that massive, you aren't just looking at a few lucky trades.
Right. It irons out the anomalies.
Completely. The sheer volume entirely eliminates the noise of daily life.
Yeah.
If a local merchant had a terrible week or, a single bridge washed out near one town...
It just vanishes into the larger statistical trend.
Exactly. What remains is an undeniable, microscopic look at human transaction behavior. And Sweden serves as the ultimate laboratory to test this behavior, mainly because of its extreme geography.
Yeah, looking at a map of Sweden, the physical layout is genuinely intimidating.
It's basically vertical.
Right. You have Malmö sitting way down in the deep, relatively temperate south, and then the country just stretches endlessly upward all the way to Luleå, which is a town perched right on the edge of the Arctic Circle.
Literally the edge of the Arctic.
The distances between these 32 towns are vast, and the terrain between them is just unforgiving. Forests, mountains, snow.
And that geographical extreme is the crucible for testing what economists call the law of one price.
Okay, lay that out for us. What is the law of one price?
So in a theoretical, frictionless reality, meaning a world with zero transportation costs and perfect information, the exact same good should cost the exact same amount everywhere.
Because if it doesn't, someone's going to exploit that.
Exactly. If a wax candle costs less in the southern town of Malmö than it does in the northern town of Stockholm, the law of one price dictates that a merchant will buy up the cheap southern candles, travel north, and sell them for a profit.
Right, the pure mechanics of arbitrage. You buy low, you sell high.
And the merchant keeps making that trip, flooding the northern market with candles until the supply balances out and the prices magically equalize. The gap basically vanishes.
Okay, but 18th century Sweden was about as far from a frictionless reality as you can possibly get on Earth.
Oh, absolutely.
There's nothing frictionless about hauling a cart through a frozen forest.
Which is exactly why the researchers used those 500,000 data points to measure the, quote, absolute logarithmic price deviations.
Okay, let's translate that out of academia.
Sure, yeah.
They basically wanted to measure the raw mathematical gap in prices between two towns.
Right. And they controlled for the scale of the numbers so they could fairly compare, say, the price gap of a cheap candle to the price gap of an expensive horse.
Got it. So they were searching for the exact moment those price gaps started to collapse.
Exactly. And the initial finding of the paper establishes a very, very harsh baseline.
Because distance is a nightmare.
Right. When they threw all the commodities into the model, they found a massive, highly significant positive correlation between the physical distance separating two towns and the price gap between them.
The tyranny of distance.
The tyranny of distance. Space was a literal tax on trade. The further apart two towns were, the more wildly divergent their prices became.
Which honestly makes perfect sense. It paints a brutal picture of the 1700s.
Yeah.
I mean, distance wasn't just a longer wagon ride. Distance meant your grain might rot in the rain.
Yep.
Distance meant you had to feed the horses hauling the wagon for another 3 rents. It meant paying guards to protect your cargo from bandits in the woods.
Every single mile added friction.
Right. Every mile added physical friction to the transaction, driving up the cost, and fracturing the national market into these isolated little islands of trade.
And you can see that friction reflected so vividly in the paper's beta coefficients.
Okay, break down the beta coefficients for us.
So the beta coefficient measures how sensitive a specific commodity's price gap is to the distance it has to travel.
Okay.
A high beta coefficient means that as distance increases, the price difference between two towns absolutely explodes.
Like the good becomes hypersensitive to geography.
Exactly. And the heaviest penalties fell on the materials that literally built the society.
Like wood and coal.
Right. Charcoal had a beta coefficient of 23.44.
Wow.
Log timber was sitting at 20.82.
That is astronomically high compared to the rest of the goods on their list.
Oh, yeah. By far the highest.
Why so high?
The value-to-weight ratio dictates that penalty. Moving a ton of heavy timber requires immense physical labor, reinforced wagons, and an incredible amount of animal feed.
But the wood itself is cheap.
Exactly. A single log of wood isn't inherently valuable. When you try to move that log 50 miles, the cost of the transportation rapidly exceeds the value of the wood itself.
You essentially go bankrupt trying to sell cheap wood to the next town over.
You really would.
So the local market for timber becomes entirely trapped.
Trapped. The people in the north are buying and selling timber at prices that have absolutely zero connection to what the people in the south are doing.
Because they literally can't reach each other.
Right. The physical weight of the commodity creates an impenetrable wall around the town.
That is fascinating. But wait, if we assume that a lack of transportation technology means everything stays local, doesn't that run headfirst into a massive paradox in this data set?
It absolutely does. The data doesn't universally punish physical limitations.
Right. Because if we look at the perishable goods, the whole theory kind of flips on its head.
The perishability paradox.
Yes. The heavy commodities like coal and wood suffer terribly from distance. But what happens when we look at the highly perishable goods? Like, think about raw beef in the 1700s.
It's a great example.
There are no refrigerated train cars. There are no ice-packed shipping containers. The logical assumption is that the market for raw meat must be incredibly localized, right?
You would think so.
Because if you attempt to load a wagon with steaks in Malmö and haul it to a town 3 weeks away, you are going to arrive with spoiled, completely unsellable cargo.
You would be rotting.
So the price of beef in the north should have zero correlation with the south. They shouldn't even be able to attempt arbitrage.
But the researchers calculated the beta coefficient for beef, and it was 0.62.
0.62
Yes.
compared to charcoal at 23.44.
Exactly. Furthermore, the distance effect for beef and for wool, actually, which had a beta of 3.76, was found to be statistically insignificant.
Meaning distance literally didn't matter for those goods?
It didn't matter.
That feels like a massive contradiction in the physics of the era. I mean, charcoal, which can sit in a wagon for 6 months without rotting, is trapped by distance.
Right.
But raw beef, which goes bad in a matter of days, completely defies geography. The price of beef was synchronizing across hundreds of miles of freezing wilderness.
It really forces us to reevaluate our assumptions about how trade actually functioned before the invention of the engine.
Right.
I mean, how does a highly perishable good bypass the tyranny of distance?
Well, it's so obvious once you think about it, but the cows aren't riding in the wagons.
No, they aren't.
They are the wagons. You don't butcher the cow and try to race the rotting meat across the country. You drive the livestock on the hoof.
The animal serves as its own transport vehicle.
It's brilliant.
The human ingenuity here lies in bypassing the friction of the wagon entirely. The cow carries the beef, the leather, and the horn. The sheep carries the wool and the mutton.
Right. They navigate the rough terrain, the mud, and the snow under their own power.
And the transaction cost of moving a living cow is essentially just the wages for the drover and whatever the cow grazes on along the side of the road.
Which is practically nothing.
Because the transport cost is so incredibly low compared to hauling dead weight like timber, the market for cattle, and therefore the price of beef, could integrate across staggering distances.
The goods walked themselves across the price gaps. That is just incredible.
It's a brilliant example of early market integration bypassing a lack of technology.
Okay, but understanding how the researchers map these price gaps over 182 years brings up a completely different, almost insurmountable problem.
The currency issue.
Yes. The physical mechanics of moving a cow are one thing, but how do you track the price of that cow over 2 centuries when the money used to buy the cow is constantly changing its identity?
The currency chaos of 18th century Sweden is truly legendary.
Reading through the monetary history of this era is like trying to solve a math equation where the numbers keep changing their shape while you look at them.
It's a nightmare.
The paper highlights this incredibly turbulent timeline. So from 1732 to 1775, merchants were forced to trade in silver dollars.
Right, and then the government entirely overhauled the system.
Of course they did.
From 1776 to 1802, the country shifted to the riksdaler specie.
Okay.
But this wasn't a clean transition. During this period, the Swedish economy was plagued by a dual accounting system.
What does that even mean?
They basically had two internal parallel units of account running simultaneously.
Oh, no.
The riksdaler bunko and the riksdaler riksgälds.
Think about the absolute nightmare this creates for a merchant, or even for a modern person trying to understand this economy.
It's so confusing.
Imagine you get paid your salary in Bitcoin, but your local grocery store only accepts prices listed in Dogecoin. And the exchange rate between the two is wildly fluctuating every single day.
That's a perfect analogy.
And then, just to add to the confusion, after 1803, the government basically says, never mind, scraps the whole thing and switches the national currency to kronor.
Which is what they use today. But for an economic historian trying to track inflation or the cost of living over a century, this creates the ultimate exchange rate trap.
Yeah, how do you even measure that?
If you attempt a traditional time series analysis if you look at a ledger and see that a bushel of wheat cost 10 silver dollars in 1740, and then you try to compare it to a ledger from 1840 where wheat costs 15 kroner.
The comparison is mathematically meaningless.
It is entirely meaningless. The underlying value of the money itself has shifted, inflated, and been redefined so many times that the chronological timeline is completely severed.
It's like you are trying to measure whether cars are getting cheaper, but the physical ruler you are using to measure them is made of rubber. The currency is stretching and shrinking, making a long-term historical graph literally impossible. So if you can't compare the past to the future, how did Crucini and Smith actually map 182 years of market integration?
They bypassed the rubber ruler entirely by abandoning the concept of time travel.
Okay.
The brilliance of their methodology is that they never compare 1740 to 1840.
Oh.
They only compare the relative prices between two different towns at the exact same frozen moment in time.
Oh, I see. So they isolated the data cross-sectionally. They only cared about the gap between, say, Malmo and Stockholm on December 21st, 1740.
Yes, because on that specific day in December, both Malmo and Stockholm are trapped inside the exact same broken currency system.
Right.
If the Swedish crown suddenly devalues the silver dollar, or if the exchange rate between the riksdaler bunko and riksgälds suddenly spikes.
That monetary shock hits the merchant in the north and the merchant in the south simultaneously.
Exactly. The currency noise completely cancels itself out.
That is so smart. You don't need to know what a silver daler is actually worth in modern terms. You only need to know that a candle in town A costs $2 and a candle in town B costs $4. The absolute gap is all that matters.
Exactly. By calculating that specific price gap for every single pair of towns, for every single year, they were able to extract a pure measurement of market isolation.
Okay.
They tracked how the gap itself shrank or grew over 182 years. They mapped a single, uninterrupted curve of price convergence that completely ignores the chaos of the changing currency.
And when they finally mapped that pure curve, the resulting graph, it completely shatters the textbook timeline of human progress.
It really does. The researchers applied a year-specific fixed effects model.
Which means what?
It's a statistical tool that isolates the overall countrywide price gap for every single year.
Yeah.
They essentially created a master timeline showing exactly how disconnected the Swedish towns were from one another.
And the graph shows this massive steep plunge, like the towns suddenly start pricing their goods identically. And this dramatic collapse of the distance penalty begins right after the year 1760.
1760. The distance function becomes distinctly flatter throughout the late 18th century.
Which is crazy early.
The gap between the frozen north and the temperate south is collapsing. The Swedish market is integrating at a rapid, sustained pace, decades before the end of the century.
And the timeline mismatch here is profound. Let's talk about 1760. We have to really visualize the technological reality of 1760.
There wasn't much.
Right. The Trollhätte Canal, which became this vital waterway for moving goods across Sweden, did not open until 1800.
And the even more massive Göta Canal didn't open until 1832.
And what about the trains?
The heavy hardware that we universally associate with the death of distance, the railways and the telegraph networks, they did not even begin to arrive in Sweden until the 1850s and 1860s.
So almost 100 years later.
Exactly. And Sweden was not secretly harboring some advanced, hyper-industrialized society. Even as late as the year 1900, fully half of Sweden's employment was still entirely rooted in manual agriculture.
So the prices converged before the technology even existed.
Before it existed.
The hardware didn't pull the market together. The steam engine and the railway were essentially just latecomers to a party that had already been raging for 80 years.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
The incredible market integration of Sweden was achieved through human effort, dirt roads, and wind power.
Now, this realization prompts an immediate, highly skeptical question from an analytical standpoint.
Which is?
Was this 1760 plunge an anomaly?
Right. Did one specific sector of the economy just happen to have a lucky streak, dragging the national average down while the rest of the country remained fractured?
Exactly. If the integration was only happening in wheat, for example, you could argue that someone just bred a slightly faster horse, or, the weather was particularly good for a few decades.
So how do we know it wasn't a fluke?
Well, to rule out an anomaly, the researchers drilled down into the specific goods.
Okay.
In Figure 3 of their study, they isolated the 12 commodities that possessed the most robust, uninterrupted data.
Like they had the most data points.
Right. Each of these 12 had over 20,000 specific price observations spanning the entire 182-year period.
So they looked at the heavy hitters: butter, hops, sawnwood, wheat. And the consensus is absolutely striking, isn't it?
It really is. With the exception of living oxen and straw, almost every single one of those 12 major commodities exhibits a flattening distance penalty starting in the late 18th century.
So almost everything.
Yes. The synchronization wasn't a fluke. It was a practically universal phenomenon occurring across entirely different sectors of the agricultural and industrial economy.
Almost the entire material world of Sweden synced up at the same time.
A silent universal agreement.
But you know what makes this 1760 turning point even more incredible? It's what was happening to the rest of the world at the exact same time.
This is where it gets really interesting.
While Sweden was pulling its domestic market into this tight, unified web, the markets in the rest of Europe were violently falling apart.
The authors draw a crucial historical comparison here, citing the work of economic historian David Jacks.
Right.
Specifically, his 2011 research focused on England.
England, the very birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nation of the era.
Exactly. But they suffered a complete internal market collapse during the Napoleonic Wars.
Tell us about that. What happened?
Well, from roughly 1793 to 1815, the geopolitics of the Napoleonic conflict, the naval blockades, and the immense internal pressure completely shattered British market integration.
Because it was too dangerous to trade.
Right. The internal price dispersion within England skyrocketed. The nation fractured back into deeply isolated local bubbles because the risk of moving goods became too high.
Meanwhile, the data from Sweden during that exact same volatile time frame tells a remarkably different story, doesn't it?
It's the exact opposite.
The convergence of Swedish wheat prices continued its downward trend smoothly and consistently.
Yeah.
The Swedish domestic market proved to be almost entirely immune to the immense geopolitical chaos that was tearing the British markets to shreds just across the water.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. England had the wealth, they had the early industrial tech, but their market shattered under pressure. Sweden was massive, rural, brutally cold, and decades away from seeing its first train track. Yet they had built an economic system so incredibly resilient that it bulletproofed their internal market against a continental war.
And this leaves us with the central mystery of the whole data set.
Right.
If it wasn't the canals, if it wasn't the trains, and if it wasn't the telegraphs, what invisible force actually killed the distance penalty in 18th century Sweden?
Well, if you aren't upgrading the heavy physical machinery of a society, you have to upgrade the unwritten rules of how that society operates.
I see.
The researchers point to the rise of what we can basically call the invisible software of the market.
Economists refer to these true drivers of early integration as institutional changes.
Institutional changes.
Okay. It is the evolution of the legal, financial, and commercial frameworks that dictate how human beings interact and trust one another over long distances.
Okay, so we are talking about the widespread adoption of things like bills of exchange.
Yes.
The mass printing and distribution of local price manuals.
Right.
The vital development of maritime insurance policies. And the meticulous standardization of commercial codes and merchant laws across different regions.
Now, to understand why this institutional software is just as powerful as the steam engine, you have to reconsider how we define distance.
Okay, how so?
In trade, Physical distance, like the literal miles between two cities, is only half of the barrier.
Right, the other half is.
The other half is composed of risk, uncertainty, and transaction costs.
Because risk is a tangible weight, it acts exactly like a physical boulder sitting in the back of a wagon.
Absolutely. Consider the reality of a merchant in 1740 trying to buy timber from a town 500 miles away. Okay? If that merchant has to physically transport a wooden chest full of silver coins across the frozen wilderness, the friction is immense.
I mean, they have to hire armed guards to prevent robbery, right?
Exactly. The slow journey ties up their capital for weeks. The sheer cost of securing that physical money makes the entire transaction wildly expensive.
Which completely isolates the local markets. It's just not worth the trouble.
Exactly. But then the legal institutions evolve.
Okay.
The courts and the merchant houses develop a system where they universally recognize and enforce a bill of exchange.
Right. And that bill of exchange is essentially a highly formalized paper IOU backed by a trusted network of banks or wealthy trading houses.
And when that institutional trust is established, the friction of the transaction evaporates overnight.
It's like the 18th century version of an API. Merchant doesn't need a wagon full of silver and a mercenary guard anymore.
No, they just carry a folded piece of paper in their coat pocket.
The financial friction disappears. Information begins to flow freely. Printed price manuals allow a buyer in the South to know exactly what wheat is selling for in the North, completely eliminating the need to send scouts or rely on rumors.
Furthermore, the introduction of maritime insurance means that a single shipwreck in the Baltic Sea no longer bankrupts a multi-generational trading family.
Right, the risk is spread out.
Because the catastrophic risk is mitigated, far more merchants are willing to attempt the long-distance shipment of goods.
Makes sense.
The supply of merchants increases, competition drives down the transaction costs, and the prices across the country begin to equalize.
So the society standardized the rules of the game. They upgraded the economic protocol of trust, and the entire national economy processed transactions faster, safer, and cheaper.
Exactly.
Even though every single piece of cargo was still being hauled by the exact same physical horses and wooden boats.
It's incredible.
The software optimization alone managed to shrink the massive geography of Sweden.
It fundamentally changes our understanding of globalization. When a merchant can explicitly trust a piece of paper across 500 miles of wilderness, the market integrates long before the steam engine is ever conceptualized.
It's such a beautiful idea, but looking at the massive data set spanning 182 years, we can't fall into the trap of thinking this institutional software was just like a magic spell that instantly cured the economy forever.
Oh, no, definitely not.
The actual day-to-day reality of maintaining this unified market was incredibly brutal, and the journey was far from a clean, unbroken downward slope.
You're right. The macro trend from 1760 onward is unmistakably pointing toward deeper integration and smaller price gaps.
Yeah, the big picture looks great.
But when you zoom in on the micro view, the year-to-year data points, particularly in the early 19th century, the graph is a jagged, cruel sawtooth of immense volatility.
A sawtooth. So the lines spike violently back up.
Yes.
The price deviations explode. The towns frequently disconnect from one another, plunging back into localized isolation.
And that jagged volatility grounds this study in the harsh reality of an agricultural society.
Right.
The data mathematically proves that market integration takes constant, exhausting human labor to maintain.
Because it's fragile.
Extremely fragile. A particularly brutal winter, a series of widespread harvest failures, a localized outbreak of disease, or even just a shift in the political winds.
Any of those could ruin it.
Yeah, any of these conditions meant that the delicate web of trust and credit could temporarily fracture.
I mean, when a town's crops fail and people are actively starving, the local price of wheat is going to absolutely skyrocket completely, regardless of what the printed price manual says it should cost in Stockholm.
Exactly. The survival instinct kicks in, the local market barricades itself, and the national network temporarily shatters.
The physical environment was in a constant state of rebellion against the institutional software. The convergence wasn't guaranteed. It was fought for, lost, and rebuilt over and over again.
It was a constant battle.
And honestly, looking at those massive spikes of failure in the 19th century data, actually makes the overarching achievement of integration feel so much more profound to me.
How so?
Well, this wasn't a passive victory won by a newly invented machine.
Mm-hmm.
It was generations of nameless merchants, farmers, drovers, and bookkeepers battling the freezing elements, battling the chaotic economy, and desperately trying to keep the fragile threads of their market tied together.
That's a great perspective.
Every single time a harvest failed and the trust shattered, they went back out into the mud the very next year to rebuild the connection.
It really serves as a monumental testament to human resilience. The software of commercial trust and societal cooperation requires constant, active maintenance. It does not sustain itself automatically.
And that historical struggle to maintain the software of trust forces a very uncomfortable reflection on how we operate in our world right now.
Yeah, the implications of this 18th century Swedish data stretch far beyond the bounds of historical economics.
It really holds up a mirror to the 21st century.
It does.
We live in an era that is completely obsessed with the supremacy of hardware. We believe that global 5G networks, massive artificial intelligence data centers, and low-Earth satellite internet constellations are the unbreakable glue that holds human civilization together.
We assume the physical technology guarantees our connection.
Right. But if the myth of technology driving integration is busted, if the Swedish data from 1732 to 1914 provides undeniable mathematical proof that human institutions, trust, and credit bridged impossible geographic gaps long before the Industrial Revolution.
Though we have to ask what happens when that trust vanishes today.
Exactly. The wooden ships and the horses did the heavy lifting, but they were entirely powered by the invisible software of cooperation.
And the comparison between Sweden and England during the Napoleonic Wars proves that even when two nations possess the exact same level of physical technology, it is the institutional software that ultimately determines whether a market survives a crisis or shatters into isolated pieces.
Because the hardware is ultimately subservient to the human framework that operates it.
Absolutely.
Think about the immense irony of the modern global economy.
Okay.
In 18th century Sweden, people managed to bridge impossible, freezing distances and unite a massive country using nothing but commercial trust, a firm handshake, and highly formalized paper credit.
They overcame overwhelming physical barriers using the sheer force of human cooperation and institutional ingenuity.
Right. And today, we have achieved the impossible. We have completely eliminated geographical distance. Information, currency, and data travel across the globe at the literal speed of light.
Yes.
Yet, look at what we are actively doing with that miraculous hardware.
Tariffs, trade wars.
Yes. Through the constant escalation of tariffs, aggressive trade wars, the fracturing of global supply chains, and deepening geopolitical isolationism, we are manually building massive artificial barriers.
We have perfected the physical hardware of globalization, but we are allowing the institutional software of trust and cooperation to rapidly decay.
If an 18th century merchant standing in the mud could synchronize a national market using a horse and a piece of paper, what does it say about us that at the absolute peak of human technological achievement, we are intentionally choosing to fracture our world?
A dark thought.
Are we heading into an era where perfect, miraculous technology is entirely neutralized by a catastrophic collapse in human cooperation?
Well, the data from 1732 provides a sobering warning, I think.
Yeah.
Distance is not merely measured in kilometers or miles. The true measure of distance is the presence or the absence of trust.
And no matter how advanced the machine is, you cannot lay a steel track across a deficit of trust. We love to look back at history and find the clean, binary moments of progress,
Yeah.
The day the steam engine was turned on, the day the world changed.
But it's never that simple.
Never. The reality of human progress is incredibly murky, built on fragile agreements and constant struggle. It was never the rails that connected us. It was always us.
That's a powerful way to end it.
Keep exploring the invisible forces that shape our world. Keep questioning the comfortable textbook narratives, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.